She didn't just slap me once. She slapped me 3 times, in front of my own daughter. And then she called that little girl trash. I still remember the sound of it. Sharp. Final. Like glass cracking somewhere deep inside a house that had, until that moment, looked perfectly fine from the outside. My name is Amara. I was 31 years old that morning, standing in my own kitchen, in my own home, believing. Foolishly, perhaps, that the life I had built with my hands was solid enough to withstand anything. And 2 hours after that slap, my mother-in-law lost everything she thought she owned. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back further than that Sunday morning. You have to go back 5 years, to the day I first walked into that house as a bride, carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart full of hope I didn't yet know would cost me so much. I met Imran at a wedding, not mine, a cousin's, where he was standing near the buffet table, looking faintly out of place, the way men often do at weddings that aren't theirs. He had kind eyes. That's the first thing I noticed. Kind, tired eyes. Like someone who had spent his whole life trying to keep everyone around him calm, even at the cost of his own peace. I didn't know then how much that particular trait of his would come to define both the best and the most painful parts of our marriage. We talked for 20 minutes that night. 20 minutes, and somehow it felt like I had known him for years. He asked about my family, my work. I was already tailoring clothes for a small clientele. Back then. Nothing grand. Just enough to feel like my hands were making something of value in the world. He listened. Really listened, the way so few people do. And when he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he lived with his mother and that she was particular about things, I laughed and told him every mother is particular. I had no idea what that word would come to mean in my life. We married within the year. It was a modest wedding, my parents doing what they could. Imran's mother, Farida, presiding over the arrangements, like a general overseeing a campaign. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to win. I remember catching her eyes across the wedding hall at one point, and instead of warmth, I saw something colder. Appraisal. Like she was measuring me against some invisible standard I hadn't been told about and would spend years failing to meet. The first few months in that house were quiet in the way a held breath is quiet. Farida would comment on how I folded the laundry. Wrong, apparently, though she never explained what right looked like. She would comment on how I cooked, how I dressed, how loudly or softly I laughed. Every comment came wrapped in the language of concern, of tradition, of just trying to help you settle in. But underneath, I could feel the current of something else. Disapproval that had decided, before I even arrived, that I would never be enough. Imran worked long hours at an engineering firm downtown, leaving before sunrise most days, returning well after dark, exhausted in a way that made him gentle but absent. I told myself, in those early years, That this was simply what marriage looked like. Adjustment. Compromise. I told myself Farida's sharp words were the growing pains of two women learning to share a home, a son, a life. I was wrong. But I didn't know it yet. Zara was born 3 years into the marriage, on a rainy Tuesday in October. And I remember the moment they placed her in my arms as the single purest moment of my entire life. She had Imran's eyes and my stubborn chin. And when she cried for the first time, it wasn't a cry of distress. It sounded, absurdly, like she was announcing her arrival to a world that had better be ready for her. I thought, foolishly, that a grandchild would soften Farida. That the arrival of new life in that house would melt whatever ice had settled between us. For a few months, it seemed to work. Farida would hold Zara, rock her gently, hum old songs under her breath in a voice I had never heard her use with me. I let myself hope, but as Zara grew older, grew louder, grew into her own personality, curious, expressive, unapologetically herself, I began to notice the shift. Farida's affection curdled slowly, the way milk turns without you noticing, until the smell hits you all at once. She's too loud, Farida would mutter, when Zara laughed too freely at dinner. Children should be seen, not heard. She eats too much for someone so small, she'd say, watching Zara reach for a second helping of rice, her eyes narrowing like she was calculating some cost only she could see. And then, the comments that cut deeper, that I tried for years to explain away as nothing. She's darker than the other children in the family, isn't she? Must get that from your side. I would swallow these words like stones, feeling them settle heavy in my stomach, telling myself that confronting her would only make things worse, that Imran was tired enough without adding this battle to his shoulders. That peace, however brittle, was worth protecting. I built my life around the edges of her disapproval. I expanded my tailoring work quietly, first taking on clients from neighboring streets, then investing, bit by bit, in a small shop 2 blocks from the house. Nothing extravagant. Just 4 sewing machines and a window that let in good afternoon light. Farida called it a hobby, dismissed it in front of guests as something to keep her busy, never imagining that within 2 years, that hobby was generating enough income to make me entirely financially independent, should I ever need to be. I didn't build that independence out of malice. I built it out of instinct. The quiet, ancient instinct that lives in the bones of women who have learned, generation after generation, that the ground beneath them is not always as solid as it looks. I didn't know, back then, exactly when, or why I might need that ground to hold firm. I only knew that I should build it anyway. The years passed in this uneasy rhythm. Small cruelties from Farida, absorbed by me, unnoticed by Imran. Buried beneath the daily business of raising a child and running a household and pretending, for everyone's sake, that we were a happy family. And in many ways, we were. Imran loved me in his tired, distracted way. Zara filled every room. She entered with a kind of light that made even Farida's coldest days bearable. I told myself this was enough. I told myself I had built something worth protecting. Which brings me back to that Sunday. It began like any other morning. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable morning that lies to you, convinces you that nothing life-altering could possibly happen within its hours. I was in the kitchen, hair tied back, sleeves rolled to my elbows, making Zara's favorite breakfast. Pancakes, always pancakes. Always with a smiley face drawn in syrup that she insisted on inspecting like a food critic before taking her first bite. "Mama," she said, tugging at the hem of my shirt with small, sticky fingers, "can I have the pancake with the smiley face today? The really big one." "Of course, baby," I said, smiling down at her, utterly unaware that this smile, this small, ordinary moment of maternal love, was about to be shattered within the hour. Farida entered the kitchen the way she always did, without announcement, without softness. Her presence immediately altering the air in the room, the way a sudden drop in temperature alters a house before a storm. She moved past the stove, past Zara's small chair, and stopped at the refrigerator, where, pinned proudly at Zara's eye level, hung a crayon drawing my daughter had made the day before. A family portrait, crude and beautiful the way only a 6-year-old's art can be 4 stick figures, holding hands beneath a lopsided yellow sun. Our names scrawled beside each figure in Zara's careful, uneven handwriting. Farida stared at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, she ripped it from the refrigerator door. "Grandma, that's my..." Zara started, her small voice rising in alarm, reaching toward the crumpled paper now, clenched in Farida's fist. "Quiet," Farida snapped, her voice cutting through the kitchen like a blade through fabric. "What is this ugly thing? You draw like an animal. You're an embarrassment, you know that. Trash. That's exactly what you are. Trash. Just like your mother raised you to be." I felt something inside me go very still. Very cold. The kind of stillness that comes right before an earthquake. When the birds go silent, and the air grows heavy, and every instinct in your body screams that something terrible is about to break the surface of the world. "Don't you dare speak to her like that," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, did not shake. It came out low and level, and carrying the full weight of 5 years of silence, finally cracking open. Farida turned to face me, her eyes blazing with something I had seen flickers of before, but never allowed to fully surface. "You raised her wrong," she spat. "You've always raised her wrong. You are nothing in this house. Nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing." And then her hand moved. Once. The sound cracked through the kitchen like something breaking apart at the seams. Twice. Zara's small face crumpled in horror, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. A third time. And this time, my ears rang with a sound I would hear replaying in my mind for the rest of my life. I didn't cry out. I didn't fall. I simply stood there, my cheek burning, my vision blurring at the edges, watching my 6-year-old daughter's world collapse in real time. Watching her small hands rise to cover her own mouth, as though she could somehow stop the moment from having happened by refusing to make a sound. She didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She just whispered, in a voice so small it barely registered above the ringing in my ears. "Mama, why did Grandma hit you?" I had no answer for her. Not then. Not in that moment. Standing in the wreckage of everything I had spent 5 years trying to hold together with quiet patience and swallowed pride. But I had an answer for Farida. I simply hadn't given it to her yet. Because in 2 hours, she would come to understand. Fully, completely, and without any room left for doubt. Exactly what it meant to spend 5 years underestimating the woman she had spent every single one of those years calling nothing. 2 hours. That's all it took to dismantle 5 years of assumptions Farida had built her entire sense of power on. But those 2 hours didn't move quickly. They stretched. Slow and unbearable. The way time does when your body is still catching up to something your mind has already understood is irreversible. The moment Farida's hand fell still, the moment the ringing in my ears began to settle into something dull and constant, I did not look at her. I looked at Zara. That was the only thing that mattered in that instant. Not the burning in my cheek. Not the rage building somewhere beneath my ribs. Not even the disbelief that a woman who had shared 5 years of meals and holidays and quiet mornings with me could turn her hand against me in front of a child. All of that would come later. In that moment, there was only my daughter, standing frozen in the middle of the kitchen, her small shoulders trembling, her eyes searching my face for some kind of explanation I did not yet have. I crossed the kitchen and knelt in front of her, ignoring the throb along my jaw, ignoring the way my knees nearly buckled from something that wasn't physical pain at all. I took her face in my hands, the way I had done 1,000 times before when she scraped a knee or woke from a nightmare, and I made my voice as steady as I could force it to be. "Mama's okay?" I whispered. "Do you hear me, baby?" "Mama's okay." She didn't believe me. I could see it in the way her eyes kept flicking toward Farida, then back to the red mark blooming across my cheek, then back to Farida again. As though she were trying to reconcile the grandmother, who sometimes hummed her to sleep with the woman who had just called her trash and struck her mother 3 times without hesitation. Why did she say that about me? Zara asked, her voice cracking on the last word. Am I trash, Mama? Something inside me broke clean in half at that question. Not the loud, dramatic kind of breaking you see in films. No, this was quieter and far more permanent. It was the sound of a woman deciding, in the space of a single heartbeat, that she would burn her entire life to the ground before she let her child believe those words for even one more second. No, I said. And this time my voice did shake, but not from weakness. From the sheer force of how much I meant it. You are not trash. You are not an embarrassment. You are the best thing I have ever done in my entire life. And don't you ever let anyone make you believe otherwise. Not Grandma. Not anyone. I looked past her. Just once, at Farida, who stood by the refrigerator with the crumpled drawing still in her fist. Her expression unreadable, somewhere between defiance and the faint, flickering beginning of doubt. She did not apologize. She did not move. She simply watched us, as though she were waiting for the scene to resolve itself. The way it always had before, with my silence, with my retreat, with the quiet erasure of whatever had just happened, so that dinner could still be made and the household could still function. But I was done making that particular sacrifice. I picked Zara up. She was getting too big for it, her legs nearly reaching my knees. But in that moment, she needed to be small again. Needed to be held the way she'd been held as an infant. And I carried her to her room, without another word to Farida. I laid her on her bed, sat beside her, and stayed there until her breathing slowed, until the trembling in her small body stilled, until exhaustion finally pulled her under into a nap, thick with the particular heaviness that follows a child's first real encounter with cruelty. I sat there a long time, after she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her chest, memorizing the curve of her face, the way you memorize things you are afraid you might lose. And it was in that stillness, in that quiet room with the curtains half drawn against the Sunday afternoon light, that something in me finally, completely, shifted. I was not the same woman who had walked into that room. I understood that clearly. The way you understand the weather has changed the moment you step outside. Before you can even name what's different about the air. I stood, smoothed the blanket over Zara's shoulders, and walked out of the room a different person than the one who had walked in. In the hallway, I took out my phone and called Imran. My hands, to my own surprise, were steady. Steadier than they had been in years, in fact. As though all the trembling I might have done in that kitchen had simply been rerouted into something colder, something far more useful. Amara, hey, I'm in the middle of a meeting. Can I call you back in? You need to come home, I said, cutting him off, my voice flat and even. No. There was a pause on the other end. The particular kind of pause that comes when someone senses, through nothing but tone, that the world has tilted somehow while they weren't looking. What's wrong? Is Zara okay? Your mother hit me, I said. 3 times, in front of our daughter. And she called Zara trash. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but I could hear, even through the phone, the sound of a man's entire understanding of his family rearranging itself in real time. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said finally, his voice low, strained. Amara, I'm so sorry. I'm coming right now. I hung up and stood in that hallway for a moment, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the strange calm that sometimes settles over a person in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. Not the absence of pain, but a kind of clarity that makes the pain temporarily irrelevant, because there are more urgent things to attend to. I did not go back to the kitchen. I did not confront Farida again, not yet. Instead, I walked into the small study Imran and I shared. More storage room than study. Really? Cluttered with old files and a desk we rarely used. And I sat down and I began to remember. I remembered the deed to the house. Tucked away in a drawer, I hadn't opened in over a year. The one that listed my name alongside Imran's. A fact my father had insisted upon when he helped fund the down payment 5 years ago. A fact Farida had conveniently, consistently, forgotten every time she reminded me. In that particular tone, she reserved just for me. Whose house I was living in, whose kindness I was supposedly benefiting from. I remembered the tailoring shop, the one she dismissed as a hobby, in front of guests, unaware that it had grown, quietly and steadily, into something that generated more income some months than Imran's own salary. I had never mentioned this to Farida. I had never needed to. But I had kept meticulous records. Every invoice, every client contract, every bank statement, filed away in folders in that very drawer. Not out of secrecy exactly, but out of the same instinct that had made me build the shop in the first place. The instinct that told me, somewhere deep in my bones, that a day might come when I would need proof of my own worth in ways that went beyond what anyone in that house was willing to acknowledge. I remembered other things too. Smaller things that felt, in retrospect, like pieces of armor I had been quietly assembling for years, without fully realizing what I was building toward. The savings account in my name alone, the one I'd opened after Zara was born, funded slowly by shop profits. Farida never knew existed. The conversation I'd had with a lawyer 2 years prior. Not because I was planning to leave, not consciously, but because a friend going through her own divorce had urged me to. At least know where you stand. And something in her voice had convinced me. It was wise advice to follow, even if I never expected to need it. Farida had spent 5 years believing I was weak because I had chosen silence. She had mistaken my patience for permission, my restraint for surrender, my quiet compliance for proof that I had nothing to fall back on. Nowhere else to go, no power of my own to speak of. She was about to learn, in the most undeniable terms possible, exactly how wrong she had been. I gathered the documents into a single folder. Bank statements, the property deed, the shop's registration papers, copies of tax filings that clearly showed years of independent income. And I placed the folder on the desk in front of me. And I waited, feeling something settle over me that I can only describe as resolve. Not rage, though the rage was certainly there, simmering beneath the surface. Resolve. The particular, unshakable resolve of a woman who has finally run out of reasons to stay small. When I heard the front door open 20 minutes later, followed by Imran's rushed footsteps down the hallway, I did not move from where I sat. I let him find me. He appeared in the doorway of the study, his tie loosened, his face pale in a way I had rarely seen on him. The particular paleness of a man confronting a truth he had spent years successfully avoiding. "Where is she?" he asked, and for a moment I thought he meant his mother, before I realized, from the direction of his gaze toward the hallway, that he meant Zara. "Sleeping," I said. "In her room." Trying to forget what she just watched happen to her mother. His eyes moved to my cheek, still faintly red, and something crossed his face. Guilt, certainly, but also something closer to grief, the slow, painful recognition of a son realizing he had spent years choosing the comfort of avoiding conflict over the safety of the people who needed him to choose differently. "Amara, I am so sorry. I should have." "You should have," I agreed, and my voice was quiet, but it carried no venom, only exhaustion. The bone, deep exhaustion of a woman who had waited 5 years for a sentence that was finally being spoken aloud. But that's not what matters right now. I opened the folder on the desk. "What matters," I continued, "is that in the next 2 hours, your mother is going to understand exactly what she's been living inside of this entire time, and exactly what she's about to lose." Imran stared at the folder, then at me, confusion and something like fear flickering across his face in equal measure. "Amara, what are you talking about? What is all this?" I said, closing the folder and standing, smoothing the front of my dress with hands that had finally stopped shaking entirely. "Is 5 years of quiet work. Your mother never noticed, because she never believed I was capable of building anything worth noticing." I walked past him, toward the hallway, toward the room, where Farida was surely still sitting, still convinced that this, like every other conflict before it, would simply be absorbed and forgotten, the way the house always absorbed her cruelty, without consequence. Imran followed, his footsteps hesitant behind mine, torn, I imagine, between the instinct to protect his mother one final time and the slowly dawning realization that protecting her had cost him something. He could no longer afford to keep losing. I stopped outside Farida's bedroom door and turned to him. "I need you to decide something right now," I said quietly. "Whose side of this house are you standing on? Because after today, there won't be room for both anymore." He didn't answer right away, but he didn't step back either. And for the first time in 5 years, that silence, his silence, felt less like avoidance and more like a man finally beginning to choose. I opened the door, I pushed the door open, and the sound of it swinging against the wall felt louder than it should have, louder than a simple door had any right to be. As though the house itself understood that whatever happened next inside That room would echo through every wall it had. Farida was sitting on the edge of her bed, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who has spent decades cultivating the appearance of control, even in moments when control has already slipped entirely from her grasp. She looked up when I entered, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief, I might have imagined it, I saw something flicker across her face that wasn't quite defiance. It looked almost like fear. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of superiority she had worn every single day since I'd married her son. "Come to apologize," she said, her voice carrying that same practiced condescension I had absorbed for 5 years without complaint. "Good. It's about time you learned your place in this house." "No," I said. And I heard my own voice as though from a distance, steady in a way that surprised even me. "I haven't come to apologize, Farida. I've come to talk about the house." Something shifted behind her eyes. The first crack, however small, in the armor she'd built around herself. "What about the house?" Imran stood in the doorway behind me, silent, his presence a strange kind of anchor. Even as he said nothing, I could feel him there, watching, waiting to see which direction his own life was about to turn. "You've spent 5 years telling me I own nothing here?" I said, keeping my voice level, refusing to let the tremor I felt inside translate into my words. "You've told me, again and again, that Zara and I exist in this house because you and your family have generously allowed it. That we are guests. That we should be grateful. You are guests." Farida snapped, though there was less certainty in it now than there had been moments before. "This is my son's house. My family's legacy. It's also my daughter's house," I said. "The daughter you called trash 2 hours ago, in her own home, in front of her own mother. After ripping apart a drawing she made with her own 2 hands out of love for this family." Farida's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, and I pressed forward because I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that if I stopped now, if I let the silence stretch even a moment longer, I might lose the courage I had spent the last 2 hours assembling piece by careful piece. "I want you to understand something before this conversation goes any further," I continued. "This house is half mine. My father's savings helped pay the down payment. My name has been on the deed since the day we signed the papers 5 years ago. It has always been there, Farida. You simply never bothered to ask." Her expression faltered, just slightly, the composure cracking at its edges like ice under pressure. "That doesn't matter. Names on paper mean nothing. This is my son's house. My family built this life, not you." Imran said quietly from the doorway, stepping forward now, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him in years. "What you did today, hitting Amara, calling Zara trash, that's not something I can just let go anymore." Farida's eyes snapped to him, and for the first time, Real alarm entered her expression. Don't you dare take her side. I am your mother. I raised you. I sacrificed everything for you, and this woman. She jabbed a finger toward me. Walked into our lives and turned my own son against the woman who gave birth to him. No one turned me against you, Imran said, his voice cracking on the last word, though he did not look away from her. You did that yourself, Ma. Today. When you raised your hand against my wife in front of my daughter. I watched the shock ripple visibly across Farida's face. She had not expected him to say it so plainly. Had not expected the son who had spent 5 years staying silent, mediating, smoothing over every conflict with careful, non-answers, to finally choose a side and speak it aloud. She provoked me, Farida said, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded hollow, brittle. The kind of excuse a person offers when they already know, somewhere beneath their pride, that it will not hold. She defended her child, Imran said. The way you should have defended mine, Ma. The way any grandmother should defend her grandchild. Not tear her down over a crayon drawing. I stepped forward and placed the folder gently on the bed beside Farida. Not thrown, not dramatic. Simply set down with the same deliberate calm I had carried since walking out of that study. It was, I think, the calm of someone who has finally stopped needing to prove anything through anger, because the proof itself would speak far louder than any raised voice could. What is this? Farida asked, though her eyes had already dropped to the folder, and something in her posture had begun to change. The straightness in her spine bending, almost imperceptibly, like a tree beginning to feel the first pressure of a wind it hadn't anticipated. Everything, I said quietly. Bank statements. The property deed with both our names on it. Registration papers for the tailoring shop. You've spent years calling my little hobby 5 years of quiet, independent work you never noticed, because you never believed I was capable of building anything you'd need to take seriously. She opened the folder with trembling hands, flipping through the pages slowly, her confidence visibly draining from her face the way color drains from skin that has just received terrible news. I watched her read the numbers on the bank statements. Figures that, I imagine, far exceeded whatever she had assumed I might be capable of earning on my own. I watched her eyes catch on the property deed, on my name printed, clearly beside her son's. A fact she had spent 5 years pretending did not exist. You've been planning this, she whispered, her voice thinner now, stripped of its earlier venom. All this time, you've been planning to take everything from me? No, I said, and for the first time since the slap, something in my voice softened. Not out of pity for her, exactly, but out of a kind of exhausted honesty. I no longer had the energy to withhold. I wasn't planning to take anything from you, Farida. I was building something to protect myself and my daughter. In case the day ever came when protection became necessary. I didn't want that day to come. But you made sure it did. This morning, in our own kitchen, Imran sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, beside his mother, running a hand over his face, in the particular way exhausted men do, when they are trying to hold themselves together, in front of two women they love who are, in this moment, us, standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Ma, he said, his voice low but steady. The house belongs to me and Amara. Both our names are on it. Not yours. You've lived here for 5 years because we welcomed you, because I believed. I wanted to believe. That family meant something real to you. The way it means something real to me. It does, Farida said, and for the first time, her voice cracked entirely. The mask she had worn for 5 years, finally slipping to reveal something underneath that looked, to my own surprise, almost like fear. Everything I did to protect this family. To protect our name, our traditions. You protected no one, I said, cutting her off, though not unkindly. You tore down a 6-year-old child until she asked me, with her own trembling voice, whether she was trash. That's not protection, Farida. That's cruelty dressed up as tradition. And I have carried it silently for 5 years, because I believed, foolishly, that silence would eventually earn me some kind of peace in this house. It never did. It only taught you that you could keep going. The room fell into a silence, so heavy it felt as though it had physical weight, pressing down on all three of us. Thick with 5 years of unspoken resentment, finally rising to the surface all at once. Farida looked at Imran, and I could see, in that single desperate glance, a lifetime of expectation. The expectation that her son would once again step in, once again smooth things over, once again choose her comfort the way he always had, no matter the cost to me or to Zara. But Imran did not move to rescue her this time. I need you to understand something, Ma, he said finally, and his voice, though quiet, did not waver. You are my mother. I love you. I will always love you, no matter what happens after today. But I cannot keep choosing your comfort over my daughter's safety. Not anymore. Not after what I saw in that kitchen. Farida's hands trembled around the folder in her lap. And I watched the weight of 5 years of assumptions collapse in on her all at once. Watched her search for some counterargument, some final defense, and find nothing solid enough to hold. What are you saying? She asked, though something in her voice told me. She already understood the shape of the answer, even before it was spoken. I looked at her then, not with the hatred I might have expected to feel in this moment, and not even with the anger that had carried me through the last 2 hours, but with a strange, quiet clarity that felt almost like grief. Grief for the relationship we might have had, if she had ever once chosen kindness over control. Grief for the years I had spent shrinking myself in the hope of earning her approval. Approval that, I now understood, had never been available to me. Under any circumstances. I'm saying, I said slowly. That in 2 hours, everything you believed you controlled in this house, your grip over this family, your assumption that I would always be too weak, too grateful, too afraid to challenge you, all of it is gone. And it didn't take a lawyer, or a screaming match, or some elaborate scheme to make it happen, Farida. It just took the truth. A truth you never once bothered to ask about. Because you never believed, not for a single moment, that I was anything more than nothing. Farida opened her mouth, as though to respond, but no words came. For the first time in 5 years, I watched her. Truly watched her. Searching for something to say, and finding, for perhaps the first time in her entire life, that there was nothing left to reach for. Imran stood slowly and turned to me. His eyes red, rimmed but clear, clearer than I had seen them in years. What happens now? He asked. And I understood the question wasn't really directed at me alone. It was directed at all 3 of us. At the fractured shape of a family trying to determine what, if anything, could be salvaged from the wreckage of that morning. I looked at Farida one final time. At the woman who had spent 5 years teaching me that my silence was the price of peace. And I felt something inside me settle into a decision I hadn't fully realized I'd already made. Now, I said quietly, we find out whether this family is willing to change, or whether it's finally time for Zara and I to build a life somewhere she never has to hear the word trash again. The silence that followed my words stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Down the hallway, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. The small, ordinary noises of a world that continued moving even as our family stood frozen at the edge of something irreversible. Farida was the one who finally broke it, though not with the fire I expected. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. You would take her away, my granddaughter. I would protect my daughter, I corrected gently. Whether that means staying in this house or leaving it depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes. Not on what you want, Farida. On what changes. Imran ran a hand through his hair, the exhaustion of the last 2 hours settling visibly into the lines of his face. He looked between his mother and me, and for the first time in 5 years, I watched him make a choice that wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about ending it, permanently, in whatever direction it needed to go. Ma, he said, sitting back down beside her, his voice gentler now but no less firm. I love you. I have loved you my entire life, and I always will. But I need you to hear me clearly, because I am not going to say this again. If you want to remain part of this family, if you want to see Zara grow up, to be present in her life, to have any relationship with either of them at all, something has to change today. Not tomorrow. Not next week when things feel calmer. Today. Farida's hands tightened around the folder still resting in her lap. What do you want from me? An apology, Imran said. A real one. Not to me. to Amara, and most importantly, to Zara, when she wakes up. Farida's eyes flicked toward me, and I saw, buried somewhere beneath the pride she had worn like armor for 5 years, something that might have been shame, though it was hard to tell. She had hidden her true feelings so well, for so long, that even she seemed uncertain how to access them now. "I don't apologize easily," she said quietly. "It was never how I was raised." "Then it's time you learned," I said. "Because the alternative is that you lose this family entirely. Not because we're punishing you, Farida, but because I refuse to raise my daughter in a house where she has to wonder, every single day, whether the person who's supposed to love her unconditionally actually believes she's worth loving at all." Something in Farida's expression shifted then. Not dramatically. Not in the way films portray sudden transformations, but in the small, quiet way real change sometimes begins, almost imperceptibly. In the space between one breath and the next. She looked down at the folder in her lap, at the papers that had, in the span of an hour, dismantled every assumption she had built her authority upon. And when she looked up again, her eyes were wet. "I was hard on her," Farida said slowly. "Because my own mother-in-law was hard on me. Harder than you can imagine. I thought that was simply what it meant to run a household. To keep order. I never..." She paused, her voice catching. "I never stopped to think about what it might feel like from the other side. What it might feel like to be the one absorbing it instead of dealing it out." It wasn't a full apology. Not yet. But it was, I understood, the first honest thing Farida had said to me in 5 years, and something about its rawness, its lack of polish, its lack of careful calculation, made it land differently than any perfectly worded apology might have. "That doesn't excuse what you did to Zara," I said. "Or to me. But I appreciate you saying it." "I know it doesn't excuse it," Farida said, and for the first time, her voice trembled with something other than anger. "I don't expect it to. I need you to understand that I never saw her as trash." I said something unforgivable, in anger, over something as small as a drawing, and I cannot undo it. I know that. But I need you to know it isn't what I believe. Not really. Then you'll have the chance to show her that," I said. "Not through words. Through time. Through actually changing the way you treat her. Every single day. Starting now. Because children remember, Farida. They remember the words far longer than we think they will. And they carry them into every relationship they build for the rest of their lives. Unless someone shows them, clearly and consistently, that those words were wrong." Imran reached over and took his mother's hand, an action that surprised me. Not because it lacked love, but because I had rarely seen him extend physical comfort to her in all the years I'd lived in that house. Perhaps, I thought, this was the first time he'd allowed himself to see her as a flawed, frightened woman, rather than simply the authority he had spent his whole life trying to please. We're going to figure this out, he said quietly, to both of us at once. But it has to be real. Not for show. Real change, starting today. Farida nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, in a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable that it startled me. I would like to speak with Zara, she said. When she wakes up. Properly. If you'll allow it. I considered this for a long moment, weighing the request against everything I had witnessed over the past 2 hours, against 5 years of accumulated hurt that could not simply be erased by a single moment of remorse, however genuine it appeared. You can speak with her, I said finally. But I will be in the room, and if I hear even a hint of the cruelty I heard this morning, this conversation we're having right now means nothing. Do you understand? I understand, Farida said quietly. We left her sitting there, folder still in her lap, and walked back down the hallway together. Imran and I, neither of us speaking for a moment, both of us processing the strange, fragile shift that had just occurred in a room that, 2 hours earlier, had felt like the sight of an ending rather than a possible beginning. Thank you, Imran said finally, as we reached the kitchen, for not leaving, for giving her a chance to actually hear this. I'm not doing this for her, I said honestly. I'm doing it because Zara deserves the chance to have a grandmother who loves her properly, if that's actually possible. But I need you to understand something too. Imran, this isn't the end of the conversation. Today isn't a single fix. If things go back to the way they were even a few weeks from now, I won't stay quiet a second time. I won't absorb this again. I know, he said. And there was a new kind of resolve in his voice, one I hadn't heard from him before that day. I should have protected both of you a long time ago. I let this happen for 5 years because it was easier than confronting her. That's on me, Amara, not just her. I appreciated the honesty, even as it carried its own weight of complicated feelings. Relief, mixed with a lingering ache for all the years his silence had cost me. Cost Zara, cost the peace I had spent so long pretending existed in that house. Zara woke roughly an hour later, rubbing her eyes, still groggy from her nap, the earlier trauma of the morning visible in the way. She moved more cautiously than usual, glancing toward the hallway, as though checking for danger, before fully entering a room. I sat beside her on the bed and gently explained that Farida wanted to speak with her, that I would be right there the entire time, that she never had to say anything or accept anything that didn't feel right to her. Do I have to? Zara asked, her small voice uncertain. No, I said firmly. You never have to. But if you want to, we can do it together. She considered this for a long moment. The particular careful consideration only children seem capable of when weighing decisions adults often rush through carelessly. Okay, she said finally. But you stay right there. I promise. We walked together to the living room, where Farida was waiting, sitting on the edge of the couch. Her hands folded in her lap in a posture that looked, for the first time in years, less like control and more like nervousness. When Zara entered, cautious, half hiding behind my leg, Farida's expression softened in a way I had rarely witnessed. "Zara," she said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Zara looked up at me, and I nodded gently, letting her know the choice remained entirely hers. She stepped forward, slowly, still holding my hand. "I said something very cruel to you today," Farida began, her voice unsteady in a way that felt, for once, entirely genuine. "I called you something you are not. You are not trash, Zara. You are a wonderful, wonderful girl, and I was wrong to say what I said. I was wrong to tear up your drawing. It was beautiful. You worked hard on it, and I destroyed it out of my own bad temper. And that wasn't fair to you." Zara's small fingers tightened around mine, but she listened, her wide eyes searching Farida's face for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or the reassurance that the woman speaking to her now was the same one who sometimes hummed lullabies and slipped her extra sweets when no one was watching. Not the one who had struck her mother and spat cruel words across the kitchen that morning. "Why did you hit Mama?" Zara asked, her voice small but steady. The question every adult in that room had been circling without quite daring to ask outright. Farida's composure wavered visibly. "Because I let my anger control me," she said. "That's not an excuse. It's simply the truth. Grown-ups are supposed to know better than that, and I didn't today. I'm going to try very hard to do better. Zara, I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I will try." It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't the kind of resolution you find in stories designed to wrap themselves up neatly within the space of a single afternoon. But it was honest, and in its honesty, I felt something in the room shift once more. Not fully healed, not fully resolved, but no longer frozen in the same rigid cruelty that had defined the morning. Zara studied her grandmother for a long moment, and then, in the way only children can offer forgiveness, freely, without the accumulated weight adults carry into every reconciliation, she stepped forward and hugged her. "Okay, Grandma," she said simply. "But don't rip up my drawings anymore. Or hit Mama. That's the rule now." Something in Farida's face crumpled at that. A mixture of relief and grief, and something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of genuine remorse. "That's the rule," she agreed, her voice thick. "I promise. I won't pretend that everything transformed perfectly from that day forward. Because life rarely offers such tidy resolutions." The weeks that followed were slow, careful, occasionally tense, as we all navigated the new boundaries that had been drawn that Sunday afternoon. Farida did not become a different person overnight. There were moments in the following months where old habits threatened to resurface. A sharp comment here, a critical glance there. But each time, I addressed it immediately, clearly, without the years of accumulated silence that had once allowed such behavior to fester unchecked. And each time, to my genuine surprise, Farida caught herself. Apologized, sometimes clumsily, sometimes too late, but consistently enough that I began to believe, slowly, that the conversation in that bedroom had actually meant something lasting. Imran changed too, in ways both large and small. He began coming home earlier, making space for conversations we had let slide for years, actively stepping in whenever tension arose, instead of retreating into the exhausted silence that had once been his default response to conflict. We went to counseling together, something I had suggested tentatively, and he had agreed to without hesitation. A small thing, perhaps, but one that would have been unthinkable in the version of our marriage that existed before that Sunday morning. As for the folder of documents I had assembled that day, the deed, the bank statements, the proof of everything Farida had spent 5 years dismissing, I never needed to use them the way I had once imagined I might. I never moved out. I never filed for divorce. I never took Zara and disappeared into some entirely separate life, the way I had, in the rawest moments of that afternoon, genuinely considered doing. But I kept them. I kept every document, updated and organized, in a drawer only I had access to, because I had learned something that Sunday that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is simply delay. And I never again wanted to find myself standing in a kitchen, absorbing cruelty directed at my daughter. Without the knowledge, solid, undeniable, entirely my own, that I possessed the power to walk away, if walking away ever became necessary again. Zara is 9 now. She still draws. Her skill has grown considerably. Her family portraits, filled now with a confidence and detail that make my chest ache with pride every time. She proudly presents one for the refrigerator. Farida still lives with us, and their relationship, while not without its occasional friction, has become something genuinely tender, built slowly and deliberately over years of consistent effort, rather than the false, brittle harmony we mistook for family in those earlier years. I think about that Sunday often, not with the raw pain it once carried, but with a kind of clarity that has only deepened with time. It taught me that the people who love us are not always the people who protect us, and that sometimes protecting the people we love requires us to become, briefly, someone we never imagined we would need to be. Someone willing to lay everything on the table, willing to risk the fragile peace of an entire household in order to ensure that a 6-year-old girl never again has to whisper the question that broke my heart that morning. She is not trash. She never was. And in the end, it wasn't punishment or revenge that changed our family. It was truth, spoken plainly, without apology, by a woman who had finally stopped believing her silence was the price required to keep the people she loved close to her. Some families are broken by cruelty. Others, if they are fortunate enough and honest enough, and brave enough to face what cruelty reveals about themselves. Find a way to be rebuilt by it instead. Ours was rebuilt. Slowly, imperfectly, but truly. And every time I watch Farida sit beside Zara now, helping her with homework, laughing at some joke only the two of them seem to understand, I remember that Sunday morning. The slap, the cruel words, the 2 hours that changed everything. And I understand, with complete certainty, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are also, somehow, impossibly, the beginning of something better